1 minute ago, high on the flank of Mount Etna, a vent no bigger than a car suddenly broke every rule in the volcano playbook. Instead of vomiting chaotic clouds of ash, it began to exhale, firing hundreds of razor-sharp smoke rings into the sky, each one a spinning halo of vapor rolling over Sicilian towns like ghostly crowns. Traffic slowed. People walked out of bars and shops and just stared, phones shaking in their hands. In the observatory, scientists froze at their screens. Volcanoes are supposed to be wild, violent, messy. So what does it mean when one of the world's most dangerous volcanoes suddenly behaves with the cold, surgical precision of a physics experiment drawn across the sky? On most days, Mount Etna dominates eastern Sicily like a dark, familiar giant. From Catania's waterfront, you see its long shoulders rising behind the city, streaked with old lava flows and crowned with a shifting plume. Planes thread past its summit on approach to the airport. Villages like Nicolosi and Zaffarana Etnea cling to its lower slopes, their streets paved with black basalt blocks cut from ancient eruptions. For people here, Etna is not a distant threat. It's part of the skyline, the soil, even the building material beneath their feet. High above those villages, the volcano's summit area is carved into overlapping craters. The most restless of them in recent years has been the southeast crater, a steep-walled bowl scarred by dozens of explosive paroxysms. Inside that crater, on a ledge of rough lava and ash, sits a much smaller feature, a vent no wider than a compact car ringed by a low, dark rim. On most days, it is just one of many openings in the crater floor, exhaling thin wisps of steam. On the day the smoke rings began, this unremarkable hole suddenly became the focus of the entire mountain. In the hours before, the display instruments at the summit recorded only modest unrest. Seismic noise ticked up slightly as gas and magma moved within the conduits. A thin, continuous plume drifted from the summit craters, tinted faintly with volcanic gases, but carrying little ash. Pilots flying nearby were alerted to minor changes, but air traffic continued. At ground level, the weather over Sicily was unusually calm. The air was cool and stable, with almost no wind aloft, conditions that would soon prove critical for what unfolded above the crater. As evening approached, the light over Etna softened. Webcams pointed at the summit showed the sky shifting from blue to deep orange. Then, almost without warning, the small vent on the southeast crater floor changed its behavior. Instead of a steady exhalation, it began to pulse. Every few seconds, a short, sharp burst of vapor shot upward from the opening. At first, it looked like ordinary puffs of gas. But as those puffs rose and slowed, something strange happened. Each burst curled back on itself and locked into a perfect ring, a spinning torus of white vapor rolling upward like a halo. Within minutes, the sky above the summit was dotted with dozens of these rings drifting and stretching as they climbed. Some held their shape for hundreds of meters before thinning into the dusk. From the villages below, people stepped out onto balconies and into streets, pointing their phones at the spectacle. To them, it looked like the volcano was blowing smoke rings in deliberate, almost playful succession. In the control rooms of the observatory, the same images appeared on larger screens alongside live seismograms and infrasound traces. For the scientists watching the display was more than beautiful. It was a rare chance to see the hidden mechanics of the volcano written clearly in the sky. A tiny vent-perfect weather, subtle shifts in gas and pressure. All had combined in a narrow window of time to produce one of Etna's strangest shows. The question now was simple and profound. What exactly was the volcano telling them with each of those flawless rings? Volcanoes are supposed to be chaotic. When most people picture an eruption, they imagine ash clouds boiling into the sky, fountains of lava, jagged bursts of gas and rock. Nothing about that image suggests precision or repetition. That is what makes Etna's smoke ring episode so extraordinary. For several hours, one of the most active and unpredictable volcanoes on Earth behaved like a perfectly tuned machine, producing almost identical structures over and over again. From the webcams and videos, the pattern is unmistakable. Each ring emerges from the vent at nearly the same interval, a short pulse of vapor that rises, curls, and snaps into a spinning torus. Some rings are almost perfectly circular with sharp edges and clean centers. Others distort as they climb, tilting or stretching in the wind. But the basic shape, a rolling hollow halo, repeats hundreds of times. In footage taken from nearby villages, you can see people counting under their breath, waiting for the next ring to appear, as if the volcano is keeping time to a silent metronome. This kind of behavior is rare. A handful of volcanoes around the world have produced smoke rings in the past, usually as a brief curiosity during otherwise noisy eruptions. Etna, however, seems to be among the most prolific. In previous years, it has generated sequences of rings during certain episodes, enough for some scientists to call it the Queen of Smoke Rings. Even so, displays of this scale, lasting for hours with ring after ring emerging from a single vent, are exceptional. They require a very specific combination of vent shape, gas pressure, magma behavior, and atmospheric conditions. The event is extraordinary not just for how it looked, but for what it reveals. Each ring is a visible trace of an invisible process: the movement of gas slugs through a narrow conduit, the rapid release of pressure at the vent, the interaction between hot vapor and cooler air. For volcanologists, watching those rings is like watching a slow-motion diagram of the volcano's breathing drawn across the sky by the volcano itself. It is a rare window into the fine details of how gas escapes from magma, how vents evolve, and how pressure is relieved without producing dangerous explosions. At the same time, the rings are a reminder that even seemingly gentle behavior can carry weight. Beautiful or not, they mean the volcano is actively degassing. Gas is moving, pressure is changing, conduits are open. In a system as restless as Etna, that activity always matters. The smoke rings may not signal an immediate threat, but they are a sign that the volcano's plumbing is busy, and that the same pathways now producing elegant halos could, under different conditions, produce something far more chaotic. To understand what Etna was doing when it blew those smoke rings, you have to shrink yourself down into the conduit beneath that tiny vent. Down there, the magma is not a smooth, glowing river. It is a thick, dark melt loaded with bubbles of gas, mostly water vapor with smaller amounts of carbon dioxide and sulfur gases. As magma rises, those bubbles grow and merge into large pockets called gas slugs. Each slug is like an invisible piston pushing its way up the conduit ahead of the melt. When a slug reaches the surface at a small round vent, everything happens very fast. The gas is suddenly freed from the pressure of the magma beneath it and blasts out into the open air. If the vent were jagged or irregular, that burst would break into a chaotic puff. But at Etna's smoke ring vent, the opening was almost perfectly circular and smooth. As the slug was expelled, the outer layer of the gas sheared against the rim of the vent, curling back and rolling around the inner core. That motion created a vortex ring, a spinning torus of gas and air like the underwater rings made by dolphins or the smoke rings blown by a skilled smoker. High-speed videos and laboratory experiments help explain why this only works under certain conditions. In lab tanks and wind tunnels, researchers fire pulses of fluid through circular nozzles, varying the speed and duration of each pulse. If the burst is too weak or too short, no stable ring forms. The fluid simply disperses. If it is too long or too strong, the ring forms and then tears itself apart. Only within a narrow range of pulse length and velocity does a clean, self-contained vortex ring appear and detach. At Etna, the gas slugs rising through the conduit must have been hitting that sweet spot again and again, creating the right kind of burst every few seconds. The atmosphere above the mountain also played a crucial role. On the day of the event, the air over Sicily was cool and unusually still. That stability allowed each ring to maintain its shape as it rose rather than being shredded by turbulence. The hot vapor from the vent mixed with cooler air and condensed into a visible halo of tiny droplets, turning an invisible structure of swirling gas into a bright white circle against the dusk sky. Had the wind been stronger or the air warmer, the rings would have distorted or vanished before anyone noticed them. While the physics of the rings is fascinating, scientists were not just watching to admire the shapes. Every pulse of gas, every ring traced into the sky was also recorded by seismic and infrasound instruments scattered around the summit. Seismometers picked up tiny vibrations as each slug burst free, while infrasound sensors detected low-frequency pressure waves in the air. By matching those signals to the timing and size of the rings seen on cameras, researchers can estimate how much gas was released, how fast it moved, and how the vent geometry changed over time. All of this feeds into Etna's broader monitoring and warning system. The volcano is surrounded by a permanent network of seismometers, GPS stations, tilt meters, and gas analyzers. Webcams watch the summit from multiple angles day and night. Data streams into the observatory in real time, where software flags unusual patterns, a spike in tremor, a sudden change in gas composition, a shift in ground tilt. When these indicators cross certain thresholds, alert levels for aviation and civil protection are raised. Pilots are warned of ash in flight paths. Emergency managers are notified if there are signs that magma is rising closer to the surface or that explosive activity is about to increase. During the smoke ring episode, these systems showed something important. Seismic and infrasound traces pulsed in sync with the rings, but overall energy remained relatively low. Gas measurements indicated vigorous degassing, but ash output stayed minimal, and ground deformation did not show a rapid, dangerous trend. In other words, the volcano was breathing hard but not breaking its boundaries. The same instruments that would sound the alarm for a hazardous ash plume or a sudden lava fountain instead confirmed that this was for now a spectacular but relatively gentle release of pressure. For the people living on Etna's slopes, the smoke ring display was more than just something to scroll past online. As the vent pulsed and rings drifted skyward, fine ash and droplets of condensed vapor began to fall from the general plume. In some neighborhoods, cars and balconies picked up a thin gray film by the end of the evening. It was not a dangerous ash fall by Etna's standards. No roofs collapsed, no roads were buried, but it was enough to remind residents that the beauty above their heads came from the same system that on other days has darkened their skies and coated their streets. Air traffic controllers watched the summit closely. Etna has disrupted flights many times before when strong ash plumes climbed into busy air lanes. During the smoke ring episode, aviation color codes were temporarily raised to reflect increased activity, and pilots were advised to avoid flying directly through the plume. Fortunately, the rings themselves carried little ash. They were mostly moisture tracing out clean white halos. Airlines adjusted routes slightly, adding a few minutes to flights, but no major cancellations were needed. Even in this relatively gentle phase, though, the event underlined how any change at Etna can ripple quickly into regional logistics. On the ground, the immediate human response split into two camps. In the villages with the best view, people gathered in small groups outside bars and on street corners, pointing their phones at the volcano and cheering when particularly large rings rose from the vent. Social media flooded with clips and photos, many tagged with words like magic and incredible. For a public used to seeing Etna as a source of worry, lava advancing toward homes, ash closing schools, this was a rare moment where the volcano seemed almost playful. At the observatory, the mood was more measured. Volcanologists and technicians watched the same rings on larger screens, overlaying them in their minds with seismic traces, gas readings, and historic records. They checked for signs that the gentle pulses were giving way to more energetic bursts, that tremor was rising, that the vent was widening or fracturing. They knew that a vent capable of producing perfect rings under calm conditions could, with a change in magma supply or gas content, shift into a more hazardous mode. Messages went out to civil protection agencies and aviation authorities summarizing the situation: activity elevated, degassing, strong ash limited, no immediate escalation expected. Local officials used the opportunity to talk about preparedness. In some communities, they reminded residents that even beautiful activity is a sign of a living volcano, and that emergency plans exist for times when Etna is less friendly. Public information channels shared both the science behind the rings and basic safety advice about ashfall and air quality. For a brief moment, the spectacle created an opening for conversations that are harder to start when the sky is clear and the volcano looks asleep. In practical terms, the consequences of this event were small light ash on cars, minor flight adjustments, and intense but short-lived focus on a single vent. In psychological terms, they were larger. The smoke ring softened Etna's image for some, turning it into a source of wonder. For others, especially those who remember more destructive eruptions, they were a reminder that even the volcano's most delicate displays are driven by the same deep forces that can, under different circumstances, reshape landscapes and lives. Among scientists who study Etna, the smoke ring episode quickly became a case study in how a volcano can communicate without shouting. On one side of the discussion are researchers who see the event as a reassuring sign of controlled degassing. In their view, the gas slugs that produce the rings are part of a healthy release mechanism. Pressure is being vented in small, frequent bursts rather than accumulating silently in plugged conduits. The rings, they argue, show a system that is finding a relatively gentle way to breathe. Others are more cautious. They agree that the rings themselves are not dangerous, but they focus on what is required to produce them: a conduit open enough to let large gas slugs rise repeatedly, a vent geometry tuned by recent activity, and a level of gas supply high enough to sustain hours of pulsing. From this perspective, the event is evidence of a very active plumbing system close to the surface, where one day it yields elegant rings, another day it might deliver noisy Strombolian bursts, lava fountains, or ash-rich explosions. The same set of pathways that now produce wonder could later carry more hazardous material with little warning. There is also a deeper debate about interpretation. Spectacular but relatively benign episodes like this can shape public perception in complex ways. Some people may come away thinking of Etna as a performer, rather than a threat more likely to decorate the sky than to disrupt their lives. Others may interpret the rings as an omen, a strange and unsettling behavior that must signal something bigger on the horizon. For scientists and authorities, managing that perception is tricky. Emphasizing the beauty and rarity of the event risks making future warnings sound overly cautious. Emphasizing the volcano's danger risks draining joy from a harmless display and feeding alarmism. Within the research community, the smoke rings also highlight questions about how far laboratory and computer models can take us. Fluid dynamics experiments and simulations capture the physics of vortex rings with impressive precision. They explain why a vent must be smooth and round, why pulse length matters, why turbulent air can shred a ring. But those models are built on controlled conditions and simplified geometries. A real volcano is messier. Conduits clog and clear. Vent rims crumble and rebuild. Gas supply fluctuates as magma bodies evolve at depth. Scientists must decide how much weight to give a single beautifully matched sequence between model and reality before applying those lessons to forecasting future behavior. Another layer of debate touches on monitoring priorities. Events like this produce rich multi-instrument datasets, high-resolution video, seismic and infrasound pulses, gas measurements, and weather observations, all tied to visible features. Some researchers argue that these natural experiments should be mined intensively, helping to calibrate how instruments respond to specific types of activity. Others worry that focusing too much on rare eye-catching episodes could distract from more mundane but dangerous trends, like slow changes in baseline tremor or long-term shifts in gas composition that are less dramatic but more predictive of serious trouble. In the background of all these technical discussions is a simple human question: what do we want from a volcano like Etna? Are we content to treat it as a spectacle when it offers one, then demand precise warnings when it turns more threatening? Or do we accept that living beside such a dynamic system means living with ambiguity, moments of wonder that cannot be entirely separated from risk and scientific insights that always carry margins of uncertainty? The smoke rings did not settle these questions. Instead, they sharpened them. They showed in slow, spinning loops how a volcano can be both teacher and hazard, both artist and engineer of its own eruptions. How we choose to read those loops, as comfort as warning or as a bit of both, will shape the way we prepare for whatever Etna writes in the sky next. In the days after the smoke rings faded, Etna's summit returned to a more familiar pattern. Intermittent puffs of gas, occasional small explosions, the steady drift of a thin plume over Sicily. The video circulated online for a while longer, accumulating likes and comments before slowly sinking into the background noise of the internet. On the mountain itself, new layers of ash settled over the vent, and the perfect geometry that had made the rings possible began to erode. The show was over, yet the episode left a mark that outlasts any individual ring. For scientists, it provided a rare, almost textbook example of how gas moves through a volcanic conduit. Matching each visible ring to its seismic and infrasound signature helps refine models, reducing some uncertainties about how Etna breathes. For local residents, the sight of those ghostly halos drifting above familiar towns was a reminder that they live next to a system of enormous power and complexity, one that can at times be gentle enough to paint the sky without causing harm. Looking ahead, the smoke rings themselves are unlikely to be remembered as a warning sign of disaster. They did not herald a major eruption, nor did they coincide with dramatic changes in ground deformation or deep magma movement. But they do point to a broader truth. Etna is constantly active, constantly rearranging its internal plumbing, constantly shifting between modes of behavior. Any vent capable of launching perfect vortex rings in calm weather is also capable under different conditions of producing ash clouds or lava jets that would demand urgent action. The real warning for the future lies not in any single display, but in the pattern they form together. Episodes of gentle degassing, Bursts of Strombolian activity, lava fountains, and long lava flows are all chapters in an ongoing story. Each new chapter adds information about which parts of the volcano are most open, which are blocked, how easily gas can escape, and how close magma sits to the surface. The more carefully these chapters are read and compared, the better the chances of recognizing when Etna shifts from performance into something more dangerous. For the people living under its shadow, the lesson is subtle but important. It is possible to appreciate the beauty of Etna's quieter moods, the glowing lava on a clear night, the perfect ring traced against a sunset sky, without forgetting that these are expressions of a restless machine. Preparedness does not mean living in fear. It means learning evacuation routes before they are needed, supporting robust monitoring networks, and listening when the quiet patterns in the data begin to tilt toward trouble. In the end, Etna's smoke rings are a reminder that nature's messages do not always come in the form of roaring explosions or falling ash. Sometimes they come as delicate shapes that last only a few minutes, telling us in their own graceful way that deep forces are at work beneath the surface. What we choose to do with that knowledge, whether we treat it as a curiosity, a warning, or an invitation to learn, will shape how ready we are when the volcano decides to change the script again. If you've made it this far, you've just watched Mount Etna break the rules of how a volcano is supposed to behave. Those ghostly rings in the sky are more than a pretty trick. They are a live signal from a restless giant that never really sleeps. If this episode shocked you, or if you've ever seen Etna with your own eyes, tell us what you think in the comments below. Did the smoke rings feel like a warning or a wonder? Thank you for watching. Hit like, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss our next volcano update.